So I'm really delighted. I was really waiting for this session for quite a while, really. So thank you so much, Catherine, for accepting my invitation. So we have Catherine Gough-Brady, who is the head of postgraduate studies at JMC Academy in Australia, and she's also an associate editor of Screenworks. Now, Catherine is an award-winning documentary producer and director who publishes on the relational nature of documentary production processes in journals, including Media Practice and Education, Screenworks, In Transition, the International Journal of Creative Media Research. This is where the article we had recommended for today's session is from, and Cultural Geographies. And Catherine has produced and directed 6 ABC TV documentary series, including Legal Briefs from 2016 and Ethics Matters from 2017. She also created 11 radio features of ABC Radio National, and her most recent TV half-an-hour ABC TV is called The Communicator, and that was in 2022. And Catherine is also head of postgraduate studies at the JMC Academy in Australia. Something has happened with my, I think I've lost the last part of your bio. I really apologize, Catherine, but if there's anything I'm missing here, if you don't mind adding this in. And obviously there's lots of exciting things about Catherine's work, which, as I said, I'm a big fan of, but I will leave it for the Q&A sections towards the end. So I'm gonna pass it on to you, Catherine, right now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Agatha. It's such an honour to be invited along to one of these sessions. So hopefully everyone can understand my Australian accent, and I suppose just call out if it becomes a bit difficult. So I'm going to share screen, so just give me a second. Actually, Agatha, maybe you have to stop sharing first.
Oh, my bad. I stopped right now.
Yeah. There we go, that button. We want the audio and we want this window. Okay. Yeah. Oh, and then I'll just pull up my own notes. Now, I'm kind of a person who works off notes, so apologies for that. Is the volume all good, Agatha?
I think it's perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about my experience of filming the non-human. And because I'm from Australia, I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm speaking, the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all First Nations people who are here today. Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded here, and the destructive and murderous process of colonisation is ongoing. I'm inspired by the Boonwurrung's deep connection to country. I participate in the reconciliation process by acknowledging the harm done and by trying to listen to Aboriginal voices. Today, where I am, is January 26, and happens to be one of the most controversial days in the process of reconciliation. It is known by a few different names, including Invasion Day. So if you're living on colonised lands, I invite you to share in the chat the lands that you are on. Thank you. So I'm not really an off-the-cuff person. So as I said, I'm going to read and I'll try and make it not too monotone. I'm a non-fiction filmmaker, and for me, creative practice theory is entwined with my practice. So to talk about one, I'm also going to need to talk about the other. I'm going to take you on the journey of someone who spent most of her life never filming nature, to someone who now constantly thinks about how to film it. So really briefly, I produced, directed and shot and edited multiple TV broadcast documentary series that were completely human-centric, both in terms of the structure, they were presenter series, but also in terms of the content, so art, law, human morality, these types of topics. We begin our journey today at the point when I decided to remove the human from my frame. This is not a hero's journey, but it does begin with an inciting incident. And I want to spend a couple of minutes setting that incident up because I see what leads to the filming as being an important part of the creative process. So let me see if I can move slides. Yes, great. Everyone can see a new slide? Yes, excellent. So in December 2018 and January 2019, there were 3 mass fish kill events that occurred in Australia on the Barker, the Darling River. In December, when the first event took place, I was busy with holidays and Christmas, and I didn't really notice. When the second event happened, I noticed it, but it was worrying, but it was taking place a long way away, 3 days drive from where I live. By the third mass event in early January, pretty much all of Australia, including me, had the headspace to care. These are some of the images that primarily came out of that third fish kill when we all took notice, and including the artist Benita Eli, who got in her car and immediately went to Menindee, a long way from any urban centre, to recreate Ophelia as a way of personifying the fish deaths. When I say mass fish kill, I should probably give a sense of what that is. An independent panel chaired by Professor Rob Verdecy concluded that over 1 million fish may have died in these events. I'm also fascinated by the use of language here, fish kill. Kill is such an active word. It implies there is a murderer, a killer. What was particularly shocking is that among the fish dying were Murray cod that were over 70 years old. Country blokes were photographed looking distraught, holding dead fish double their age. The image of the happy man and the fish he caught had been reinvented as the pieta. These men who normally extract fish from the river were crying as they watched them die in front of them. The cod became tragic heroes in a story of climate change, compounded by bad and greedy water management. Not only did we have shocking numbers dying, but the fish dying were individuals with wisdom and story. It's important to understand that the Barker is a key part of our main river system in Australia, the Murray-Darling. It is emotionally important to Australians, especially those based on the eastern seaboard, and that's most of us. So after the third fish kill, I spent a week prepping, getting filming permissions.
Ellie was becoming responsive. She was having like...
Hello? Sorry.
Yes, I think it was part of the video playing. I think.
No, something. Anyway, I'm sorry. I've just got someone. They're driving in at 2:42 in the morning. That was a late night for them. So it was summer. So after the third kill, I spent a week prepping, getting filming permissions, testing out shot ideas, building my own periscope, finding out how to deal with a snake bite. And I got into my little urban Hyundai Getz car with my camera, and I headed up the dirt roads to take a look. By the time I got there, the dead fish had been cleaned up, but the Barker River had completely stopped flowing. So it was summer, it was hot and dry in the mid-40s, it's around 113 Fahrenheit. I tramped through the ground litter of the bush, carrying my heavy film equipment with its hard edges. I'm looking ahead to find shots as well as looking down for those snakes and bull ants. Overhead, I'm listening for the cracking sounds that indicate that a red river gum is dropping one of its massive boughs. One dropped as I set up for my very first shot, so I'm careful. These trees line the rivers, and they're also called widowmakers. Canadian ethnographer Philip Vanini suggests ethnographic journeys are wanderings through which movement speaks. But here, on the stagnant Darling River, I do not film as I move. Instead, I film stillness. The river no longer moves, so I avoid creating movement with the frame. I capture a series of shots that will end in images containing no water, no movement at all. For Vanini, movement symbolises interweaving stories, binding self, others, places and times. Here, it is the horror of stillness that binds us. Okay, I want to show you some of the film. I'll show you a section from Barker. Please note that I collaborated with the sound designers and composers Carl Barber Hoffman and Mitchell Waters to create this. They used the audio I recorded on location to generate the compositions, including their really brilliant idea of galah bird calls as the rhythmic structure. So let's hopefully see if this plays. So at this point, what I'd like to introduce is Agnes Varda's term cinecriture. Varda says, cinecriture isn't the scenario, it's the ensemble of exploratory walks, the choices, the inspirations, the words one writes, the shooting, the editing. The film is the product of all of these different moments. What Varda calls cinecriture is comparable with what Vanini labels the wanderings. So far in this talk, what I've done is take you on my wanderings through the cinecrature, including the tech. Varda's idea of cinecrature opens up an understanding of the myriad of influences on the creation of documentary and the combination of malleability and certainty. Varda recognises that film is made by humans with all of our preoccupations, biases and needs, that we humans exist in a body located in a time and a place, and that this affects what the filmmaker creates. Cinecrature can be viewed as a new materialist idea because Varda speaks about the relationship between her filmmaker self and the world of things around her. She explores the effect those relationships have on the formation of her films. It is a relational approach. I've hinted at my urbanity and my lack of nature skills, the extreme remoteness of the nature I was filming, how hot it was when I got there, how the fish had become alive with story, that the imagery was being reinvented to capture the tragedy and the emotional importance of the river system to Australians. All of these things feed into that moment when I press record. Alongside these pre-existing ideas is my desire to capture what I see in a way that it can easily recognise itself. And in saying this, I recognise that there is a kind of Althusserian or Butlers correspondence between how we see ourselves and how we are seen. With people, this process is fairly simple because I can show them edits and they can comment and feedback. With nature, this is trickier for me. When travelling up to the river system, I thought its true identity, how it would see itself, would be wild and unruly. A romantic and quite frankly racist notion, since it has been tens of thousands of years since the river system was wild. Upon arrival and further investigation, I found that the identity of the rivers included being managed or mismanaged. They were used by people and by animals who were also part of the river system. The river isn't just the water and the fish. To be in the world of the rivers, I needed to understand its worldview and not just impose my own. Therefore, the footage I planned to shoot changed to include the imagery of the trees and the animals near the river and the dams and regulators on it. This was also what makes up the system. And yet, while I grew to realise that people are part of the river system, I did not include people's stories in the film, instead focusing on the other parts of the system speaking to the audience. At that point in my life, I was really angry with people and what people were doing to the river, and I wanted the river to have agency. I admit this is in part because I felt I'd lost my own agency and sought to find it in the rivers. This desire to find agency is what I brought to the relationship, what helped set up the meeting place of the film. For me, the film that results from all of this cinecrature is an artifact that forms the meeting place between what is filmed, the filmmakers, and the audience. As the filmmaker, it's my job to find that meeting place. I don't always find it. Tim Ingold expresses a similar relational quality when he says, practitioners are wanderers, wayfarers, whose skill lies in their ability to find the grain of the world's becoming and to follow its course while bending it to their evolving purpose. With the Rivers film, I was so unconfident that I had found any meeting place at all, that I hadn't found the grain. But it turns out that I'd found an unexpected meeting place. It was with the people who live on the river system, the people who I had excluded. They also felt a loss of agency, and this film visualised their emotional state. Because they saw themselves as part of the river system, they didn't need to see themselves in the film to see themselves in the film. It's a highly experimental film, and I'll show you a little more soon. And it went viral on social media with those who were part of the river. They shared the film with each other. And it was surprising to me because I erroneously saw experimental film as being an urban cosmopolitan format. And I have to say, I felt really proud that I found this meeting place. I'm so often chasing that broad and international audience, but here was a particular community for whom the film had a real function. Excuse me. They could say, watch this, that's how I feel. So this next section of the film is from the Barmer region of the Murray River, and that always flows, and it provides a contrast to the later Barker section of the film. And apologies, I'm not entirely sure how this will go over the internet because it involves quite a lot of movement. So I'll just find that excerpt for everyone.
I think, Catherine, you're still muted, I'm afraid.
Oh, well spotted. Thank you. What I want to talk about next is how anthropocentric our film language is and how filming nature can challenge this. Film theorist Laura Rascaroli suggests that for filmmakers, meaning can be created in the position occupied by the embodied spectator. For a stranger viewer, someone who's not part of the filmmaking process, they had no knowledge of what is being filmed other than what is in the film. So that film must include all that is necessary to create meaning. There is a dialogue that takes place with the viewer when they read the film, using their knowledge of how they've read other films. In my film Rivers, people were neither embodied in front of nor behind the lens. I did not film any people, and I did not shoot this film from my eyeline. When I say that the embodied human is removed, I do not mean that the relationship of the filmmaker to what is filmed is removed, or even people to landscape. I take embodiment to refer to a physicality in or of the shot, rather than what is captured in the shot. Let me explain. For Helen Hughes, environmental documentaries offer a chance to step away from the human as the base of scale. Frame sizes, such as head and shoulders shot or mid shot, which are named for how they film a human, become less important in understanding the frame in an environmental documentary. Hughes says this shift in perspective from the medium shot towards the long shot reflects a change in narrative position in which the story of place is included in the individual story. I would have to agree. I found removing humans from the shots changed my relationship with scale and frame size. The majority of my shots were long, or what I call wide shots. A long shot is, just in case you're not familiar, a shot where you can see the entire human in it. So that shot you just saw of the glass on the trunk in the river can be considered a long shot because the whole galah is in it. It may feel like a mid shot, but is it? In my previous TV documentaries, the majority of shots I used were, the mid shot and the head and shoulders shot. The shots that formed the mainstay of my work when filming people had disappeared from my palette when filming a river. It was disconcerting. My use of filming the wide shots was also somewhat influenced by my lack of experience in shooting nature. I had not brought with me the right lenses. I didn't have a 300 to 500mm lens, the type used in nature docs to get those close-ups of animals. And what is interesting is I still don't have one of those lenses in my kit. I was forced to learn to use lenses designed to film people to instead film nature, and in the process learn how to do that. What it means is that I have to be nearby to what I film. What I film is as aware of my presence as much as I am of its presence. And I had to build a relationship with what I filmed to be able to film it. We had to get used to each other. And that relational quality is something I like about filmmaking and want to keep in the way that I film nature. Karen Barrard says, knowing is not a matter of reflecting at a distance. Rather, it is an active and specific practice of engagement. To know is to become entangled. And to give you a sense of this, I'll play an excerpt from an essay film I made about creating rivers.
Each morning the kangaroos would travel along the riverside. The water is just behind me. Initially, I'm uncertain of what to film and I form a disruption and blockage. And I was too much of an unknown for the goats. But over the 3 days, the river system and I grew used to each other. I would turn around after filming and find curious kangaroos. They hopped closer. I was no longer a blockage, more something behaving oddly. Philosopher Pierre Bourdieu wrote about habitus and fields. My habitus, my disposition, who I am as a result of my experiences, was beginning to acclimatise to the field of the river. The field is the group of external forces acting upon each other. The field was beginning to accept me, and I was beginning to accept it. For me, making a film is a social act, so Bourdieu's theories can help explain what I am doing.
So as well as a preference for wide shots and close-ups, rather than the mid and headshot, I quickly began to favour a low position for the camera, hardly ever bringing the camera more than 70 centimetres above the ground. Partly this low position was an aesthetic choice to be closer to the water, but mostly it was practical. It was the length of the tripod without extending the legs. Given there was no human in shot, there was no need to both fight off the bull ants climbing my own legs and raise the legs of the tripod. This meant that almost none of the film is shot from my human eyeline. The materiality of the camera tripod and the fierceness of the bull ants determined the camera height, rather than the height of people. Despite the low position, the camera angle was frequently parallel to the ground. There was no need to look up, as there was no person defining that up. In a sense, it's more correct to say low camera height rather than low camera angle, as angle is defined by the relationship between the camera and the film subject's eyes. This is not the first film to be shot from this height. Ozu famously used tatami shots to film from the eye line of a person sitting on a tatami mat, but Ozu's shots were still about replicating the human eye line and were positioned accordingly to film other humans. Building on Helen Hughes's work, Smell and Davis propose a consideration of scale and a multi-scalar approach in particular in order to reorient the place of the human. When I returned to Melbourne to begin the edit, I found this reorientation of scale to be a problem. I was not used to editing so many wide shots together, and I was unsure how to do it. I normally cut on action, especially human bodies in movement, but there were no human bodies moving. Karen Perlman describes editing as the alignment of the editor's living, breathing body with the material being edited, usually another body with its own breath and rhythms. Here, I was attempting to align my body with a landscape to do what I needed to make, and to do that, I needed to make the image as big as a landscape so that I could see all the parts of it. The kangaroo eating, the birds flying, the trees swaying. These became like the involuntary movement of the breath and the rate of eyelids that inform editing choices when cutting a person. I had to learn to read the river system like I can read a body. In the end, I had to move my editing system to an unused classroom to be able to cut it as I watched the image being projected onto a large screen. Only then could I develop a sense of the editing rhythm needed. I needed to see at large scale to understand what I was even cutting. In this film, maybe not yet. In this film, I explored ways I might film nature, how I might create relationships with it, and what might be in the frame and what lenses I might use. And there's a whole lot of other stuff around temporality and representation that I also dealt with, but we won't go into that today. But despite all of this experimentation, it is a classic observational film. I'm filming the river when it's in crisis, a well-worn documentary observation technique to capture the most emotional and charged footage. Donna Haraway talks about it being a problem to focus on the crisis. She prefers the word urgency. Urgency is energizing. It's not about apocalypse or crisis. It's about inhabiting. It's about cultivating responsibility. And so I thought about how I might film nature without observing a crisis. When I do this with people, I interview them. They talk about what happened prior to the interview, how they feel about it, what they might think might happen next. There is a reflexivity that transverses time and feels what post-humanist philosopher Rosie Braidotti perceives as the present becoming both a memory and a promise. The interviewee might be revealing the past, but they are here and now and rarely in the crisis during the interview. Returning to Haraway, I was interested in how she paraphrases Marilyn Strathern when she suggests it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. If an interview is a method or a matter that we use when filming humans, what would occur if that method is applied to the non-human? How does using an interview as a method change the way I film and edit the footage of something I would normally observe? So I set out to interview a tree that is not in crisis. And now we've caught up with ideas that I'm still thinking through and unpacking. And I realised when making the short essay film I'm about to play that in placing the interview in opposition to observation in terms of the type of footage, I had actually set up a false dichotomy, and that maybe what I was really exploring was the ability for the viewer to listen to something other than words, to see landscape as a subject rather than landscape as a backdrop to people. I want to say at this point, I find thinking through filmmaking a vital part of my research process. I might think up an idea, and it might seem reasonable in text, and people will nod and agree as I verbalise it. But as soon as I start cutting it in film, I can see where it might be flawed or overstated. I think through film. And rather than use film to answer research questions, I use it to understand what I'm really asking. By the end of creating an essay film, a better question is posed. I'm in alignment with what Roy Haney said here at the last talk, but also a growing number of creative practice researchers, that a process of listening occurs in the filmmaking that leads towards an awareness of the question. This is different than what is often expected in academia, where a research question is posed and a linear argument that leads towards a singular solution answers the question. And I actually have epistemological problems with the idea that the argument leading towards a singular conclusion is the way I want to express my understanding of the world. I'm not interested in finding the right answer that can be supported by the evidence I selected to include. I'm more interested in navigating through complex systems and finding narrative pathways. Narrative pathways are more interesting when they wind and turn, offering different views and outlooks. Ai Weiwei said in an interview with the editor Niels Parr Anderson on the creative process, if you're a master, you only know the road, you don't know where to go. So we're trying to search the road towards some kind of result. And here we are, back at the idea of wandering and syncreture. So I'm going to show you this short film I created as part of my process of starting to think about the interview as a method for filming the non-human.
It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, not knots. What thoughts, think thoughts. What descriptions, describe descriptions. What ties, tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories.
You know, for the great artists of China, there is that ability, to control the unbridled energy and channel it and contain it in particular kinds of forms. And that is why, this empty space in between, it's not left over, it is created by the artist.
An interview is a way of telling a story. An interview contextualizes what is being discussed, linking it to the past and the present and the future. Given the way we tell stories matters, is it possible to directly interview the non-human? Maybe we can notice the created spaces of the past and the future in the observational footage. For Rosie Bradotti, in this continuous flow, the present becomes both a memory and a promise. If that is the case, does this shot become more than an observation of one point in time? Could it even be a response to the question, Luxor, what's it like to be a temple?
Sorry, it's okay.
This tree that will take you back to the tree I was going to interview. And trees in Australia can live for centuries and predate colonisation, and they can have meaning and significance and existing relationships with people and story. I chose a young tree that didn't already have existing meaning and relationships. While Haraway is interested in closing the breach between nature and culture, and I agree with her, this is a complicated task in a colonised landscape. Nature is not one thing, and culture is not one thing. Bringing them together has to be done with respect for the multitude of natures and cultures. So I chose a young tree, so I was not appropriating existing stories. For those familiar with decolonising methodologies, I want to make clear that interviewing a tree is not a First Nations approach. While interviewing landscapes is based upon land being a holder of knowledge, it is also predicated on it being separate to me, and so I interrogate it to find things out. For instance, this tree that I filmed is in Dja Dja Wurrung country, and Trent Nelson is the chairperson of the Dja Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation. He says, "For my people, the Jandak, the land is our being. The land is our being. I don't have that sense of oneness with what I film. It overwhelms me. I lose myself in it via the camera, desperately trying to understand it, but we are not one. I have a classic post-industrial sense of separate self-identity." Once I'd settled on the format of using the written questions to evoke the method of the interview, I found that this changed the way I cut the material together. Now the footage needs to answer rather than be. I went back to shoot new material because the coverage I needed for an interview differs from that of observational material. For instance, I shot new images of the sky, the nearby creek and the nearby road, as these were important parts of answering the question about place that I asked the tree. In an observational version of the edit, these shots would form distractions from the central theme of the tree and would never make the cut. I purposely asked the tree questions that I could also ask a human. This was so I could begin to understand how the tree and I differ. I feel the most interesting answer is to the question of being worried about death. I realised as I cut together the footage that as humans we are concerned with the binary of life and death, but for a tree there is no binary of life and death. I feel that using the tree as an interview, using the interview as a method changed my creative processes and forced me to think about the opinion experience of the tree rather than merely reproduce its audiovisualness. The structure of the interview forced me to film the tree differently and to cut the footage differently, but I don't know that this contains the quality of a human interview where the present is a memory and a promise. I'm still working that through. I'll show you an excerpt from that film. So this film is truly an experiment rather than an experimental film. This is because I wanted to discover how my creative process would change when using the method of the interview. The film is done surprisingly well, considering that it's not a piece of art. It's being broadcast on TV in Austria, used by experimental improv musicians in Australia, been nominated for an award and screened in various countries. But it is also one of the very few films I've made when nearly everyone feels the need to tell me how I made it wrong and how I should have made it. The comments are not that it is a good or a bad film, but that it is made wrong. I wouldn't have used the paper tags. I wouldn't have asked those questions. I would have used a contact mic. It goes on. No doubt you too will also have an opinion of what I got wrong with this film. At first, I was a bit pissed off by this. I don't usually have this kind of reaction to my work. Then as time went on, I thought, why are people doing this? And I've come to the conclusion that it's because it is the first tentative steps towards a new way of relating to a tree, of filming a tree, and as a result, exploring a new film language. For instance, someone said to me at a conference, I could start filming people the way I filmed the tree. I show parts of the tree cut by the frame into sections, much like the shot you're seeing now. I wasn't really using long shots very much at all for the tree. So she suggested I could shoot parts of people rather than a mid-shot. And without realizing I had actually started to do that. I just hadn't made the link. So there is a sense that the film language I'm using for the tree, I'm bringing back to how I film the people. Because the film language is not set and does not reflect existing ways that people connect with trees, people don't interview trees, people can't say, oh yeah, that's a good or a bad example of that kind of film language. So they assess the film by the relationship they would form with the tree, and the film is almost never going to be that. A subset of the audience really like it because they can see I'm provoking in this film, but a whole lot of people mostly just seem really annoyed with me for making it. They can't find a meeting place in it, and I think that comes back to this film quite literally being an experiment. So me being me, and I do like to provoke, I'm making another interview with nature film. And this one is a piece of art. People are going to be happier with that. I can tell from the fundraising trailer I've made for it that they're already finding a meeting place in this work. For this one, rather than interviewing one thing, a tree, I'm interviewing a sand dune, an ecosystem. In this film, there are no shots of people and also no shots of animals. Instead, there are tracks that suggest their existence. Questions are not ones I would ask a human. I'm collaborating with the composer Gough-Brady to create this project, and the brief I gave her was purposely loose, as I'm interested to see what she dreams up. The previous film was one tree, one filmmaker. This film is an ecosystem and a couple of artists. And we're still in post-production for this project, which we aim to finish in April this year. So sadly, that means I don't yet have any of Gail's contribution to play for you. So what I'll play for you is just a promotional trailer to give you a sense of the imagery. Okay, so we're kind of nearly at the end of what I was going to talk about. Sorry, I've been a little bit longer because of the transferring around things. I'm very briefly going to talk about this project. And I might just play it in the PowerPoint because I want to talk over the top of the images. So I pulled people out of the frame and now I'm ready to put them back in. Here I'm seeing if I'll film this park. This is just a series of test shots, and I will. It's a large park, 4 kilometres from the centre of Melbourne, and that's Melbourne in the centre of the frame, in amongst the trees. So the park follows a river bend, and as with so many river bends, there's a freeway running through it. And I want to capture that human-nature collision in a place close to where many people live, not, 3 days drive away in somewhere remote. In this park, there's been a women's prison, 2 mental asylums, and a place where Aboriginal people were rounded up and forced to live. All of them are completely knocked down now. The river itself has been moved in parts to allow for a freeway to be built. And, if you follow it along to the right here, there are thousands of flying foxes who are becoming endangered, who summer along this section of the river. So there's an interesting marginal quality to this park. Rather than being in crisis, I plan to capture things that are at the edges of sight or run counter to mainstream, the undercurrents. I want to weave the contemporary and historical together, returning to Brodotti's idea of that, memory and a promise. So the film will not all be wide shots like this, but there will be these spaces created when people empty out of the frame, a sort of almost uncomfortable moment of engaging with nature. I want to create the space so the viewers can listen to the non-human alongside the human. So I've come to the end of my talk. In true fashion, there's not really a conclusion, just an open ending. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It was absolutely fascinating. I have to say that, again, as always, I wish we had much more time for the discussion. So I'm just gonna start straight away, if you're okay with this, because I really think there's lots of depth here we can uncover. I can think at least 3 people in the public who I know will have questions, because I'm thinking about you, Jeremy, you, Tim, and partially you, Francisco, because your work kind of can really get a lot of inspiration from what Catherine was talking about today. I'd like to kind of go back to your work, Catherine, and I think just kind of to give you my view, because one of the reasons I really love your work is because of this kind of self-reflective and very consistent across your different work, philosophical exploration of the work of filmmaker and academic, and something you've mentioned today, this idea of thinking through filmmaking. It's really visible in your work, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the kind of source of your work as we currently see how it's progressing with the kind of following project, I think it also starts with the characters interrupted, where you kind of explore the idea of what the character of film could be, and you kind of look at the philosophy behind it. And I really find it really fascinating how you take it now to another level, where you just remove a human kind of participant in this. And I find it really, really fascinating. Is it something you could, is there something you could comment about this kind of process of continuity across your pieces of work?
Yeah, look, there's probably strands, right? And so, there's this strand which is focused on thinking about changing things up with filming nature. And that comes from a kind of sort of academic activist position, I suppose, of thinking, well, things are not going well with us in nature. And as a filmmaker, could I do something different in the way that I film to, shake up that existing relationship, which is not working? But then, there are other films that go on, because films take a long time, right? You know, and so I'll be thinking through something on a film that might be coming towards its end, and then, you know, another film is starting, and so in the period of time when I was filming things without humans, you know, I was cutting together a documentary that was all about humans. So, you know, these concerns kind of run parallel, I suppose, in my work. Yeah, I'm not sure if that kind of answered or not.
It does, and then again, we could talk quite a lot about kind of your other past work and how it kind of relates together. But I just invite everyone to look at your website or all the other places where we can see your films and kind of draw these conclusions in their own time. What I'm gonna do very quickly, I'm gonna go back to the chat first, because there are lots of requests. Catherine, I don't know if you would be happy to share your talk with people. People really loved what you were talking about, and they were asking about some quotes. So that's one request. So we can discuss it afterwards. And then there's a really nice question here, actually two of them. So the first one is from Elizabeth. And the question is, how do we navigate the idea of informed consent with non-human participants?
Look, I know there are people thinking about this, and it's becoming kind of one of these areas. And I know that people in this audience have been writing and thinking about this. I haven't, I have to say, been thinking about this, but except for that section when I was talking about the lenses I was using and being in the same space. So, you know, look, you can't always do that. You can do that in Australia because, you know, the dangerous nature is not such that you can't be in the same space as it, right? So there's a sense in which those kangaroos weren't very interested in me filming them until they sorted out who I was. And so, you know, in the final film, that footage of them all kind of stopping and going, oh my God, what is this, along our riverbank that we normally just jump along, that doesn't make the film, right? Because it's, you know, in a sense, it's almost you haven't yet got permission to film footage, right? Whereas later on, we get to know each other a bit more. And, you know, I don't know, with the tree, I don't know if the tree had any say in it. And I'm just not sure how a tree would have a say in it. And it's, so I'm really sorry, Elizabeth, I haven't got any wisdom on this, but I'm intrigued to know what other people have been doing and thinking around it.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take the last question here from the chat, and I'll get back to you just in a second. So Dominique asks, how do you prepare to create a framing?
So I imagine you're saying set up the shot, is that right? How to set up the shot?
Dominique, would you like to unmute yourself, perhaps?
Sorry, yes. Basically, I was just interested, physically, how do you prepare yourself to take a shot? And also, I noticed you use a tripod as well. So.
Yes. So it's interesting. I've just actually been writing about that, so I can actually comment on that one more than the other question. So there is a sense in which I find there's a process of unpacking equipment, right? That happens, you know, you get to a location, and sure, when I'm filming this, quite often it's like a really minimal kind of situation because I'm wandering around that I've got in terms of the equipment to unpack, but there still is that moment of setup, right? And I find that the moment of setup when I'm working with nature is different than the moment of setup when I'm working with people, because the type of relationship is not the same. So with nature, it's much more about a kind of slow, methodical setup, which allows space for me to start to notice things. Whereas with people, I'm trying to kind of navigate that relationship with them and generally trying to appear incompetent and give them power, so that, you know, things will kind of open up easier afterwards once I'm filming. But with nature, it's not that. It's just about me trying to notice as I set up. Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes, thank you. But also, I'm just wondering, do you tune into your bodily presence? Do you tune to yourself? And at one point you said something about there's no embodiment going on, neither front nor.
Yeah, no, I don't know about other people, but I find when I'm filming, I'm completely not at all tuned into my own body. Yeah, it's interesting how, you know, like you can be really sick and then you pick up the camera, you start filming and you don't cough or you don't, you know what I mean? Like there's this whole thing that goes on where it's just all about connecting with what's out there rather than being all self-aware about yourself. I find that anyway, yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank
I
you.
might have follow-up questions, but I want to give space to everyone. So, Jess, would you like to ask your questions? I think you were next, and then we come back to the questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. There's very interesting work, and I've seen your films a few times now. The River film 4 times now, including this one.
Oh.
And you mentioned it's taken me to something that sort of is what Agatha was remarking about, sort of connection with what I do as well.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something just in passing, and obviously with an hour and a half, you don't have a lot of time to explore this. But you mentioned this idea of scale and size of nature when you were there, and you know the sort of the idea of Bergson's durational kairos rather than chronos. That's my input into it. But when you showed it to the river people, as I call them, I mean, I don't know what forgive me for the
I like it.
the name
we
of the
don't
people.
use that term, but it's lovely. Yeah.
Okay, so the river people. What did you show it on a big screen or a wee screen?
No.
Because
yes,
for me, I think this would be really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I've only seen your work on a small screen, so I
yes.
have to try and imagine if it's on a big screen, which I think would be much more relevant.
So this also surprised me that it went kind of all around on this social media, because that's always small screens, right? People are watching on their phone and stuff. And I couldn't cut it small. Like I've got a fairly big screen, but like I had to go massive. And so I thought, well, that's it. This is like only for film festivals. You'll never be able to watch this small. But it turns out it didn't matter. So it was only for me for cutting, I think, that I needed to see it big. But yeah, no, I was surprised by that because I thought, oh no, this won't work on a small screen. But yeah, it did. So yeah.
So is this so is there something else going on with reimagining then in from the point of view of the viewer in relationship to yourself?
Yeah. Do you want to?
I mean, you don't have to answer that question. It's just something.
No.
It's like,
I just,
you know.
I mean, I can go down a path, but I'm not sure if it's answering what you just asked. I think, you know, I had my urban prejudices about what people might watch and what not watch, because, you know, people in deep country, you know, there's no experimental film theatres and stuff like that. So there's not really a kind of like experience of watching this kind of work. But it turned out that really didn't matter, because it was showing something that they felt and that they saw, you know, on a daily basis, right? Like I don't think they would watch an experimental film about somewhere else. And people who lived on other rivers didn't watch this, right? It was people who lived on this river, right? So I think I underestimated the one that I'd actually worked out how to depict this river in a way that was meaningful, and two, that these people, that, you know, we all have the ability to watch quite experimental works. Yeah, and so that was my bad. And so yeah, I have changed my view of audience, and I wonder too if the reason it works small is because we're quite good at noticing lots of things without necessarily noticing them. But when you're cutting, you have to actually see them, you know. Whereas when you're watching it, you can kind of absorb all this stuff. But that's all very kind of just me talking off the top of my head.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
I just want to comment, and then we take Christine's question. It goes back to this, again, I think questions of creating knowledge through the process itself. And I really like how you link to what Roy was talking about last month about not necessarily responding to any very specific questions, but the process itself and thinking through filmmaking is what matters here. And kind of this idea of how you get ready to prepare your shots, how you get ready to in the last two examples you showed us, interview the nature, how you kind of create this experiment to create a new way of creating this knowledge. I think this is, again, something we could perhaps, if we have time, talk about. So I'm just going to ask Christine to ask your question, if that's okay.
Oh, you muted.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Catherine. I did a PhD with Catherine, so I'm really familiar with your work. And I think I was one of the people who went about the interviewing the tree. Oh my God, how could you be so literal of the written word? And so I just was, for some bizarre reason, watching that beautiful film again, I thought, you know, when people say that they're looking for alien life forms in space, and I've always thought to myself, but how will you know? How will you recognize them? So it's that feeling of this incredible disjunction between the way that we communicate, i.e. we talk and write, and the way a tree communicates. So I just wanted you to talk a bit more about how you made the decision to use those written labels. Like when you thought about interviewing nature, what was the sort of process that you went through to try to decide how to do that and then how to represent that?
Yeah,
Fantastic
well,
question.
yeah, it was actually going to be quite different. I had this whole plan where the community from the township where the tree was going to come down, and we were going to put images of them and images of the tree on their mobile phones and hang them from the tree and film that. So, you know, like I had a very different conception of what this kind of interview and connection with the tree might be. And then I did some test shots and it looked terrible. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And plus also I would have had to film it. Like I had about a 10-minute period of time at sunset when the light was right to capture the tree and the phones. So it was like a tricky shoot. And then I thought, oh, well, why don't I go back to being literal, right? Rather than kind of conceptual about this. And then I thought, well, these tags, they reminded me of, like, you know, the science tags scientists put. But then I played a visible evidence, and apparently in America they have tags like this in the forest to guide walkers.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so I didn't know that. But also then I used string and paper because I figured the paper comes from the tree and the string comes from plants. And I held them because I still wanted that sense of I'm asking. The human is actually posing the question. So that's kind of how it came to that very literal place of the interview. And I think it did change, like going so literal did change the way I cut, and that other version, it might have been a lovely community art event, but I'm not sure it would have had that kind of same kind of rethinking about the way I film and cut a tree. Yeah.
And seeing it for a second time really deepened my appreciation of it, because I realised, you know, I'm waiting for, well, of course, the tree's not going to answer you. And then after my brain does that sort of stupid immediate thought, then you're showing this other, where the tree is. And then I start to see the answer to the question. Like it's lovely the way the process, the film makes this process happen in my mind, and I start to go, oh, the answer is here. It's in these grasses. It's in this water. It's in this wind. So yeah, so thank you. Beautiful work.
Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. I think we might, before we take Francisco's questions, I think we just look at Alan's question here in a chat, because he links to what we're talking about right now. And Alan is asking a question related to Elizabeth above and Catherine's comment now. Can you speak a bit more about non-human agency? And then he kind of goes on a little bit about traditional agency. So I'll leave a little bit for people to read, but I wonder if you'd like to perhaps comment a little bit about the non-human agency, because I think you really linked very nicely to Christine's question about all the trees not going to respond to you.
Yeah, well, I'm probably focused on it in terms of what has the ability to speak to the audience, right? I mean, because agency is such a big thing. It's a sense of, I suppose, even more unsilencing. So like that idea, because I brought up agency with the river film, there's a sense in which we treat these things as for us. And then what would happen if we said, well, no, it's not for us, it's its own thing. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to do in terms of agency, to go, okay, what if it was its own thing? And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm getting at around this. Yeah. That's
fantastic.
Yeah.
We only have about 4 minutes left, so I think it might be the last question, Francisco, and then I will read some comments from the chat. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, Francisco.
Just before Francisco asks the question, people who are thinking about, the question Elizabeth asked around filming the non-human and ethics and permission, I'd love to hear what people have been writing. So if you can email me stuff, that'd be awesome. Sorry, Francisco. Yeah.
Hi, Catherine. Well, so congrats, brilliant talking and thinking and process about. I love everything. So my question is very related to Christine one. So I'm going to jump that question, go for more a straight one and direct one, and maybe how can, if that's the case, in terms of festivals or placing your work as a no-fiction filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, how would you label, or what kind of category would you like to use in terms of the different modes of documentary? It is a performative documentary, or you can think about more critical observational documentary, or that doesn't matter for you? I'm asking this because for my PhD, I'm struggling with this kind of terminology, doing my experimental film as well, and try to go beyond this word experimental filmmaking.
Yeah, I think I'm probably more focused on so the desire of the filmmaker. So coming from that angle, rather than going, oh, what mode is it? Which is almost like coming from the other direction. And so that sort of, you might intend, like I said, I intended to make an experimental film, but when we look back on it, we can go, well, actually, it uses the tropes of classic observational by picking a moment of crisis. And that's kind of inbuilt in me as a documentary filmmaker. So there's a sense in which sometimes these modes are just unconscious, I'd have to say, in what I'm doing. And I probably pick them because I think, oh yeah, that will work well for that. But then what's interesting is to then kind of go against that, which is a sense, I suppose, what I'm trying to do with the interview projects, and to become kind of more aware of these tropes that I work in. But I probably don't set out going, this is the mode. I set out, I think, more in terms of what is it that I want to say? What is it I think that what I'm filming wants to say? And then try and find something in there. And then what I love about the filming process is that, of course, something completely different happens. Right. Yeah. That's what's so wonderful about documentary. It's just all the planning in the world. It then just goes right.
Yeah, thank you. Good, great.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure if that really kind of addresses
No, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's a kind of, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, lots of comments. I'm gonna make sure I'll try to share the comments with you, Catherine, after this, because I think there's lots of nice things and people really enjoyed the talk, obviously. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you and really appreciate, because of course it's the middle of the night for you. So incredible dedication to have you here today with us. Thank you so very much. I will talk to you afterwards to see, or I will send you an email afterwards to see if we can have the copy of your talk or in some version, and I could share with participants. I just want to very quickly, for literally 10 seconds, share my screen to tell everyone what's happening next week, very quick. Oh, next month rather, so fast. So on the last Wednesday of February, which is 22nd of February, same time, we have Yakavos Panagopoulos from Ionian University in Greece, and he's going to be talking about in the quest of creating a third path in cinema in the Greek academic and filmmaking environment. So another fascinating talk. But for today, once again, thank you, Catherine. It was absolutely wonderful hearing your thoughts, and we really all look forward to see your future films and future writing. So thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.